The first thing you should know about me is this: I did not grow up dreaming of revenge. I grew up dreaming of safety. My name is Clara, and I'm telling you this story now from a quiet house filled with plants, old photographs, and the kind of silence that only comes after a long life. I'm in my 70s now, my hands slower, my voice softer, but my memory? Sharp as ever. There was a time when I believed that marrying the right man would save me. I was raised in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where girls were praised for being agreeable and boys were praised for being bold. My family didn't have much. What we had was routine: early mornings, tired evenings, and the understanding that survival came before dreams. I loved school. I loved learning. But loving something didn't mean you got to keep it. By my teenage years, it was made clear, without anyone saying it directly, that my future would not be chosen by me. It would be arranged through obedience, patience, and silence. I was taught how to cook, how to clean, how to smile at the right moments. I was not taught how to say no. When I was 19, I met a man everyone admired. He was older, wealthy, confident in the way that made people listen when he spoke. My parents were impressed. Neighbors were impressed. Everyone said the same thing: "You'll be taken care of." No one asked if I was in love. I told myself love would come later. I told myself comfort was enough. I told myself this was how women built a future, by stepping into one already prepared for them. The wedding was beautiful. Flowers, music, congratulations whispered into my ears like promises. I remember standing beside him, thinking my life was about to begin. What I didn't know was that my life had already been bargained. Only weeks after the marriage, something shifted. His kindness cooled. His patience disappeared. And when a certain document was read aloud, one filled with legal words I barely understood, I saw something in his eyes that frightened me. That was the day he learned something he didn't like. And shortly after, he decided I was the problem. I didn't know it yet, but a lie had already been planted inside my marriage. A lie about my body, a lie about my future, a lie that would almost destroy me. But lies, no matter how carefully spoken, have a way of cracking. The night after the will was read, my husband didn't touch me. That alone should have warned me. He locked himself in his study for hours, the sound of his footsteps pacing back and forth like an animal trapped in too small a cage. I stayed in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with my hands folded, replaying the lawyer's words in my mind. Something about heirs, something about conditions. I hadn't understood it all, but I had understood one thing clearly: whatever was written on that paper mattered more to him than I did. When he finally came in, his face had changed. The charm was gone. What stood in front of me wasn't a husband. It was a strategist. He told me his father had been cruel. He said the will was designed to punish him. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice, like he was sharing a secret meant only for us. "We can never have children," he said. "If we do, we lose everything." I remember blinking, confused. The words didn't fit with what I'd heard earlier, but doubt has a way of shrinking when it's pressed on by authority. He spoke confidently. I was young. I had been taught that questioning a husband was the same as betrayal. When I hesitated, he snapped, "You don't understand these things, I do." And just like that, the truth was replaced with obedience. From that moment on, my life became smaller. Visits from my family were suddenly inconvenient. Friends faded away without explanation. Every outing required permission. Every decision was corrected, adjusted, or dismissed. He framed it as protection. He always did. "You don't need to worry," he'd say. "I'll handle everything." What he really meant was, "You don't get a say." The house grew quiet in a way that felt wrong. Too large, too empty. I filled my days with small tasks, polishing surfaces that were already clean, rereading the same magazines, counting hours until nightfall. At social gatherings, people asked about children. He smiled for them. At home, he punished me for the reminder. I began to believe I was defective, broken in some invisible way, and then came the doctor. He told me it was routine. A checkup, something minor. He insisted on being present, answering questions before I could open my mouth. When surgery was mentioned, fear flooded me, but fear had already become familiar. The morning of the procedure, the clinic smelled like antiseptic and rain-soaked coats. I remember the ceiling lights blurring as medication entered my veins. And then, his voice. Close, calm, certain. That was when he told me the truth. Not the whole truth, just enough to make sure I couldn't stop what was coming. And as my body went still, I realized too late that love had never been his goal. Control was. I don't remember falling asleep. I remember realizing I couldn't move. The room felt distant, like I was underwater. The ceiling lights blurred into one long white streak, and my body no longer responded when my mind told it to scream. Panic rose fast, but panic needs muscles, and mine were gone. That's when he leaned in. His face appeared above me, calm and satisfied, like a man finishing paperwork instead of dismantling someone's life. His voice was low, almost tender. "You'll never have children," he said. "I made sure of it." He spoke as if he were doing me a favor. He explained just enough for it to hurt, how everything depended on control, how I was a risk he couldn't afford, how this was the cleanest solution. He told me I wouldn't remember much. He told me it was already done. Then he straightened up and walked away. I tried to cry. My eyes burned, but no sound came out. I stared at the ceiling and waited for something, anything, to stop it. A nurse, a miracle, darkness. When I woke later, the pain arrived slowly, like my body was afraid to tell me the truth all at once. My abdomen throbbed. There was a bandage where there hadn't been one before. The room was quiet, empty. That's when the grief hit. It wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It folded in on itself and sat heavy in my chest. I believed him. I believed what he had said in that final moment. I believed my future had been cut out of me without my consent. I lay there staring at the wall, thinking of things I'd never have: first steps, bedtime stories, a child calling my name. For the first time in my life, I wondered if disappearing would be easier than continuing. And then I felt something in my hand. At first, I thought it was a muscle spasm. Then I realized my fingers were curled around something that didn't belong there. Carefully, slowly, I opened my palm, a scrap of paper. Tiny, folded tight, damp from sweat. My heart began to pound, not with fear, but with confusion. I unfolded it inch by inch, afraid that reading it would finish breaking me. The message was short, uneven handwriting. Rushed. I didn't do what he asked. "You're safe. And there's something else you need to know." I read it again, and again. My breath caught in my throat as understanding crashed over me like a wave. Everything I thought I had lost was still there. And suddenly, survival wasn't enough anymore. I wasn't just alive. I had something to protect. I must have read that note 20 times. My hands shook so badly I worried someone would walk in and see the paper fluttering like a trapped bird. The words were simple, but they rearranged my entire reality. He hadn't done it. Not really. The doctor, quiet, observant, someone I barely remembered speaking to, had made a choice. A dangerous one. He had pretended to comply, leaving only a surface wound, just enough to satisfy the lie my husband wanted to believe. And then came the sentence that stole the air from my lungs: "You were already pregnant." I pressed my free hand to my stomach, forgetting the pain, forgetting the room, forgetting everything except the sudden, overwhelming certainty that I was not empty. I was not broken. Something alive existed inside me, something my husband had tried to erase without knowing he was already too late. Joy came first, then terror. Because if my husband discovered the truth, I knew exactly what kind of man he would become. I folded the note until it was no bigger than a coin and hid it beneath the mattress before anyone could return. By the time a nurse came in, I had already decided something important. I would survive quietly. When my husband arrived later that day, he brought flowers and satisfaction. He kissed my forehead like a man congratulating himself. He spoke about recovery, about peace, about how everything would be simpler now. I nodded, I thanked him, I played the role he expected. Inside, I was counting time. The days that followed became a performance. I moved slowly. I complained of weakness. I allowed myself to look defeated. When sympathy was offered, I accepted it. When pity came, I let it stay. It was the safest disguise. At night, alone in the bed he no longer shared, I lay awake listening to the house breathe. I rested my hand against my abdomen and whispered promises I had never planned to make. "I will protect you, no matter what." I learned to watch him carefully. I noticed how relaxed he became, how his guard lowered once he believed the threat was gone. He talked freely now, about money, about loopholes, about ways to bend rules meant to be unbreakable. He didn't see me as a variable anymore. That was his mistake. I changed my clothes to hide what little changed in my body. I adjusted my posture. I memorized excuses. Recovery, hormones, weight gain, lies built on truths no one questioned. And quietly, I began reaching outward. There were people who knew things my husband assumed were buried. People who had read documents he had twisted. People who still believed in rules, even when power tried to ignore them. I didn't need revenge yet. I needed timing. Because the truth, when revealed too early, can be crushed. But when revealed at the right moment, it destroys everything built on lies. The first time I picked up the phone, I hung it up again. My heart was racing too fast, my hands too damp. Fear has a way of convincing you that silence is safer than truth. I stood there in the hallway, listening to the house settle around me, reminding myself that this was still my home, even if it no longer felt like it belonged to me. I waited for the right moment. My husband had patterns, he always did. Certain days meant business trips. Certain hours meant meetings that couldn't be interrupted. When he left confidently, believing nothing in that house could move without his permission. That was when I acted. The man I called was not a friend. He wasn't family. He was someone my husband respected only because he had to, the attorney who had read the will months earlier, the one whose voice had changed everything without him even realizing it. When he answered, his tone was cautious. Yes, I told him my name. There was a pause. I need to ask you something, I said, keeping my voice steady, and I need the truth. The silence on the other end stretched long enough to make my stomach tighten. I asked him about the clause, about children, about inheritance, about whether what my husband had told me was real or convenient. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, precise. You were lied to, he said. That was all I needed to hear. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of that confirmation settle. Every doubt I'd swallowed, every moment I'd blamed myself, every fear I'd carried, it all had a name now. Deception. I told him everything. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just the facts, the appointment, the surgery, the lie whispered while I was unable to move. The note. The pregnancy. When I finished, he didn't interrupt. He didn't rush me. He simply said, "You're in danger." He explained what my husband had risked and what he had already lost without realizing it. He told me there were protections written into the very document my husband thought he controlled. Safeguards for exactly this kind of manipulation. But timing mattered. You can't reveal this privately, he warned. Power like his survives in the shadows. You'll need witnesses. From that moment on, we planned every detail, every document, every safeguard. The doctor who had spared me agreed to provide records, test results, proof that could not be erased or denied. Everything would be ready when the moment came. I hung up the phone, changed. I was no longer just hiding. I was preparing. And every day that passed, every smile my husband gave me in his false peace only strengthened my resolve. Because he believed the danger had passed. He had no idea it was growing. By the 4th month, my body began to betray the secret I was keeping. Not loudly, not obviously, just enough to make me cautious. I learned quickly how to dress for misdirection. Loose sweaters, heavy shawls, high-waisted skirts that disguised change as softness. I blamed everything on recovery, hormones, weakness. No one questioned it, especially not my husband. He had already decided I was finished. That belief made him careless. He talked freely now. About money he hadn't fully unlocked. About ways to bend rules written by men he considered dead and irrelevant. Sometimes he spoke as if I wasn't even in the room. Other times he spoke to me like one speaks to furniture, present but not listening. I listened anyway. At night, when the house was quiet, I memorized details. Dates, names, intentions spoken too casually to be lies. I repeated them in my head like prayers, knowing they would matter later. Meanwhile, I kept my appointments quietly. Different towns, different times. The attorney guided me carefully, reminding me that secrecy was not cowardice, it was strategy. The doctor documented everything, every test, every timestamp, every contradiction that proved my husband's story false. What surprised me most was how calm I became. Fear had burned itself out, replaced by something colder and steadier. Purpose. I stopped asking why this had happened to me and started asking how to end it properly. My husband planned a gathering without realizing what he was offering me. A formal dinner, influential guests, business partners, a judge he wanted to impress. lawyers who could confirm or deny his version of events in a single sentence. He spoke about it proudly, convinced it would secure his future. I nodded, smiled, helped plan the menu. Inside, I knew that night would be the end of pretending. The day of the dinner, I moved carefully. I didn't raise my voice when I entered the room. I didn't have to. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to mouths. Every eye followed the same line of realization, from my face to my body to the truth I had stopped hiding. My husband turned slowly. At first he looked confused, then angry, then afraid. "That's not possible," he said, too loudly, too fast. "You can't be," and that's when he made his final mistake. The words tumbled out of him without control. Accusations, claims, a confession disguised as outrage. He spoke of doctors, of procedures, of guarantees he believed he had purchased. No one interrupted him. They didn't need to. The attorney stood next, calm and precise, placing documents on the table one by one: medical records, signed statements, test results dated before the surgery, evidence that did not argue, it simply existed. The judge read silently, slowly, thoroughly. When he looked up, his expression had changed. What followed was not chaos, it was order. Questions were asked, answers were demanded. My husband tried to regain control, but control doesn't survive daylight. Every attempt to explain only confirmed what he had already revealed. When the legal consequences were explained, he stopped speaking. The room felt smaller then, heavy, final. I stood there, one hand resting over my stomach, and for the first time since my wedding day, I felt tall. Not victorious, just free. By the end of the night, decisions had been made that could not be undone. Authority shifted. Power realigned. My husband was escorted out of the house he believed was his, carrying nothing but his certainty that this wasn't how things were supposed to go. I watched him leave without satisfaction, because what I felt wasn't revenge, it was release. The weeks that followed were quiet in a different way. Legal matters moved forward. Safeguards were placed where there had been none. For the first time, I slept without fear of footsteps outside my door. And when my child was born months later, into a life no longer built on lies, I understood something clearly. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. People often ask me if I felt powerful after everything ended. The truth is, power was never what I was chasing. What I wanted, what I needed, was peace. The months after the truth came out were not dramatic. They were quiet, administrative, careful. Paperwork replaced fear. Conversations replaced silence. For the first time in my adult life, my future was shaped by planning instead of avoidance. I moved out of the house filled with echoes and into a smaller place with sunlight and open windows. I planted a garden there, not because I was good at it, but because growing something felt right. Every morning, I watered the soil and reminded myself that life responds to care more than control. When my child was born, I didn't feel like a heroine. I felt present. I held that small body against mine and understood something I hadn't before. Survival is not the same as living, but it makes living possible. Everything I had endured, every lie, every quiet moment of fear, ended there, in that room, with a future breathing against my chest. I raised my child with honesty. Not bitterness, not vengeance, just truth given gently and at the right time. I taught them that love does not demand silence and safety does not require obedience. I watched them grow into someone who knew how to speak without fear and stand without apology. As for my former husband, his life narrowed the way mine once had. Not because I wished it, but because choices shape outcomes. I felt no joy in his downfall, only distance. Years passed, the world changed. I aged. Now, when I sit in my living room with a warm drink in my hands, I sometimes think about the woman I was when this story began. Young, quiet, certain that endurance was the same thing as strength. She was wrong. Strength came later, when I stopped enduring and started deciding. If there is one thing I want anyone hearing this to understand, it's this. Control often disguises itself as care. Silence often pretends to be peace. And survival, while necessary, is not the finish line. Living is. I didn't win because someone else lost. I won because I refused to disappear. And that, more than anything, is what remains. If you're still here listening, remember this: your voice matters before the breaking point. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth when it's least expected.